David, this morning you have another new and interesting concept to introduce to our viewers. How are you this morning, David?
I'm very well, Jason. Good to be with you.
Good to see you. So, we spoke last week about the mallow, magical living objects, but I don't know if we really got into detail as far as exactly what that is. It is quite interesting how all these acronyms and things coming out of the evil Batcave, the Electronic Visualization Bright Advanced Technology Cave, they choose these acronyms that seem very incongruent with a scientific facility like an electronic visualization laboratory. I don't want people to think that you and I are making this stuff up out of nowhere. We've got wizards to talk about today. We have all kinds of things to discuss. Where should we begin?
Well, I was going back through the events organized by the Electronic Visualization Laboratory at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to see if there were any events leading up to the events of 9/11, if you will, that might relate to, I don't know, motive, opportunity, and weapon. So lo and behold, I look up June 2001, and there is a Marlowe drama that was staged as part of a MFA Master of Fine Arts thesis by a student whose name I won't even attempt to pronounce. I think he probably looks rather like a Thai name, but that's nothing, that's kind of irrelevant. But it introduces this concept of a magic living object as a virtual wizard that can then be injected into networks such as the optical fiber network that is synchronized through National Physical Laboratory time back in Teddington in Middlesex in the United Kingdom, where they invented the cesium fountain clock. And what these Turkish have done is, I don't want to be disrespectful to Turkeys, but what they appear to have done is actually they've hardwired, if that's an appropriate term, dark fiber networks to the cesium fountain clock in Teddington, and these dark fiber networks are available for rent. And it appears, I believe, that we will one day be able to prove that they're being rented out by organized crime groups, in particular the shareholder group of SERCO that met on the 47th floor of the North Tower, which included two enormous teachers' pension funds, TIAA, which is Teachers Insurance Annuity Association of the United States, which is the largest private pension in the world. And in its wisdom, it presumably pays pension benefits to the likes of Bernardine Dawn and Bill Ayers, the Weather Underground terrorist leaders, who are psychopaths, unindicted psychopaths who should be behind bars. And that's kind of worrying because Bill Ayers was on faculty at the University of Illinois, Chicago, which is the host of the Electronic Visualization Laboratory. And his wife, Bernardine Dawn, who lectures on torture paradigms and practice at Northwestern, she was there for decades. And she was also taken on at Sidley Austin, it would appear, to groom, excuse me, a couple of other teachers by the name of Barack Hussein Obama and Michelle LaVaughn Robinson. So now it kind of should make Americans really worried that there is potentially a rogue artificial intelligence programmed virtual wizard skulking, if that's the right word, on dark fiber networks controlled by the British company that has been given the extraordinary responsibility for operating the National Visa Center, which brought in the Osama bin Laden sleeper cells, the Defense Ammunition Center, which makes or tracks all the ammunitions in the world, and the United States Patent and Trademark Office. So I think what I'm suggesting that we do with the show today and the later one for sponsors only is demonstrate how we might track this Marlowe virtual reality or virtual wizard and see if we can connect him through to the attacks of 911 or the crashes of the Boeing 737 MAX 8s. Over to you.
Right. And so again, Malo, MALO, is a magical living object. And what we're saying, David, is that I want to talk about semantics a little bit, but actually, before we get into that, I want to remind our viewers, David, that we're making a little bit of a change to the format. You and I have previously been doing 2 days a week. We've been doing shows on Wednesdays and Fridays, and we were spending an hour on Wednesday and then about an hour and 45 minutes or an hour and a half to 2 hours on Fridays. And we've been creating these illustrative photo collages, which I think, we've been getting very positive feedback. Our audience seems to enjoy. The reason we do this is because it creates a very visually oriented story that goes along with the story that you are sharing with us, and hopefully helps people understand what we're talking about. There's a lot of complicated concepts that you touch on with the cesium fountain clock, and sometimes seeing these actual things can be quite helpful. We're talking about Kaz Sunstein, and seeing him is quite interesting. Maureen Baginski, who felt that 9/11 was a gift to the NSA. Of course, our friend Wilbur Ross, and the odious debt that students are burdened by. It's an interesting way for people to visualize these different, admittedly complex components of the story that you tell, but it takes us so much time to put these storyboards together. We've decided to focus the show into one day, and moving forward, we're going to be doing that. So we really want to encourage people to join us on patreon.com/CSI Storyboards and patreon.com/Crowdsource the Truth, because what we're going to start doing is on Fridays, we'll have the preview show that we normally have here on YouTube and Periscope and DLive and Facebook and all the other platforms. And then the show will culminate on our exclusive subscriber-only segment on patreon.com/reverse-CSI Storyboards and patreon.com/Crowdsource the Truth. So we really want to encourage people to go to those sites, become sponsors. We can't carry on this work without the sponsorship of the viewers, and we feel this is a better way to efficiently handle our time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I'd like to, as an engineer, we tend to build things and do things, and we have end goals in mind. And I think a lot of people I talk to feel depressed at the scale of the problem. First of all, they can't get their heads around it. Secondly, they believe no one could be so monstrous as to want to execute this kind of brutality on the human race. And then, they think there's nothing they can do about it. Well, I'm suggesting, as an engineer, and having studied this with you and illustrated this concept and discovered that there are virtual magicians or wizards floating around on the internet, well, they have to be tracked and, dare I say it, exterminated, right? Now, how do we do that? Well, I think we have to equip our patrons, students, and I was one once, you were one once, alumni. Well, I'm an alumnus of Cambridge University. Barack Hussein Obama is an alumnus of, a whole number of interesting places, Harvard, Occidental, and Columbia, none of whom can produce the records that he ever went there, but, I'm perhaps being unkind. But he was on faculty at Chicago University, and if he turns out to be an enemy, as I believe, of American citizens and the American future, it's very important to know if he's spun off any part of his character into this virtual wizard that went floating around the internet. And I think it's germane to the issue to look at his blackboard there, what he's putting up on the blackboard, and combine that with what his mentor told him or told Americans. And his mentor, of course, was Bernadine Dawn at Sidley Austin, the terrorist leader. And she, back in the 70s, issued a manifesto. These losers love to issue manifestos of what other people should do, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, her comment, or one of her comments, was, guard your planes, guard your colleges, guard your children, and guard your doors.
And banks.
And banks, right? So fast forward to Barack Hussein Obama, and he's up on the sketching out on the blackboard what I believe looks like a liquidation agenda. That is to say, he's connected up. If we can zoom in a little bit, he's connected up. That is corporations, banks, utilities such as PG&E, which is going to be sued for billions of dollars after the California fire, and possibly some combination of conventional parties like the Democrats and the GOP. And he's drawn a line down and diagonally through a dollar sign into something I can't quite make out, but the material above says relationships built on self-interest. Well, how about this, the self-interest of the elite faculty? Their pension funds, TIAA, probably represents $1.5 trillion of assets under management. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
The university's superannuation scheme in the UK, which would be the equivalent, represents, I think, 50 billion pounds, let's say, of assets under management. Basically, you put the two together, and these elite teachers groups that have been working with the United States and the United Kingdom Patent Office way before World War II, but very importantly, they have $1.5 trillion of assets under management, much of which is invested in companies that maybe the average teacher doesn't want to invest, like Motorola or Wackenhut, etc. Now, the student debt, I believe, in the United Kingdom and the United States is about 1.5 trillion. So here's, let's say, a goal, and whether it's feasible and whether I'm enough of a forensic economist to be able to look at all the risks and rewards. But how about we say to the teachers, the elite teachers that have injected this virtual wizard into the internet to presumably execute the objectives of Barack Hussein Obama, which is liquidate corporations. How about we consolidate the teachers' pension fund with student debt? Now, what does that mean? That means the teachers ordinarily would hope to teach the students something that gives them job prospects, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And maybe some students, want to be engineers and maybe go into aerospace, right? Maybe work for Boeing. Well, wouldn't it be interesting if the teachers had injected a mallow, a magic living object, into the command and control systems or air traffic control systems of the Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft, where the world's largest non-state air traffic controller is SERCO. So when those two Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft crashed because apparently some software injected or imbued with artificial intelligence decided to override the wishes of the pilot and crash the plane, then maybe it's not so much Boeing's negligence, but maybe it's a hack by people who claim to be ethical hackers, right? So if we zoom over to the side there, I think the word is pan, we find an ethical hacker in a wizard costume. Perhaps you could just elaborate on some of the impedimenta on the wizard hacker's table. Over to you.
Right. Well, first of all, it's important that we clarify, because some wizards out there, David, are extremely litigious. We're not accusing anyone of anything. This photo collage is a piece of artwork. It is a piece of political cartoonery. It is, despite being photorealistic, it is political commentary. And Mr. Swigert, who is depicted as Swigert the Red right here, we're not saying that he did these things, but he is representative of a wizard who could teach other wizards, or could create software wizards, or could hypothetically, theoretically, speculatively be involved in these sorts of operations based on the public comments that he has made, where he's injected himself into this public discourse as someone who has appeared on the news, someone who is an author publishing books, putting his photograph out there, and making daily commentary in social media. Of course, we know Mr. Swigert was himself a teacher, having written the Ethical Hacker's Handbook, sort of a guide for anyone to become an ethical hacker. He's given boot camps and various instructional courses, so we don't know exactly what, if any, role he may have had. Perhaps one of his students could have done any of these things, but we've got some things here on the Wizard's table. First of all, the metronome is there because, as you've been pointing out to us, David, timing is critically important. The metronome, of course, is in vertical alignment with the cesium fountain clock, the most accurate clock in the world. And you and I have spoken in the past about how it might be difficult for the average layperson to understand the importance of timing in a sophisticated operation. But I made an analogy last week to my work in the film industry and how in the 1990s, the simple addition of something called key code by Kodak, where timing information was stored with every film frame on celluloid film, that might not immediately make sense to someone who's not involved with film, but this enabled digital editing technologies that are now standard today, digital audio technologies, a variety of different things. So when we're talking about complex operations like the coordination of multiple aircraft, the coordination of what could very well be controlled demolitions and things like this, timing is critical, and the accuracy of the timing is most important. So the cesium fountain clock is represented figuratively by this metronome. Of course, we've got the melting clock made famous by Salvador Dali's Persistence of Memory. Why don't you fill us in, David? I'm not sure that I necessarily know what all these things stand for.
So when I went through that Mallow drama event, which was in June of 2001, and it was an event staged at the Electronic Visualization Laboratory at the University of Illinois, Chicago, I noticed that the student who was presenting it had picked three very interesting objects, which I find might have been very appropriate to the injection of a virtual wizard into the exercises of 911, where it would appear a continuity of government exercise was switched through a simulation on the Boeing AWACS aircraft into a live fire event, such that, let's say, hypothetically, the Captain Gerald DeConto, the duty officer of the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center, got onto the communication link to the Secretary of the Navy, Gordon England, because he realized the incoming weapons platform heading his way was actually transmitting friend signals, and the missile battery on the roof of the Pentagon had been basically stood down because the missiles were not supposed to fire at friendly aircraft. So he got on the phone, as I understand it, to to Gordon England, Secretary of the Navy, who stalled him. So that manual override, to launch the missiles was never engaged. So the weapons platform, carrying probably an air-to-ground missile, released the missile, which punched a tunnel through 8 walls of the Pentagon into or through the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center, where possibly an ancillary explosive killed everyone. Almost obliterated them. As far as I know, there's been no autopsy, right? And the interior hole is 12 feet in diameter with a ton and a half of debris on the inside. So the interesting opportunity for our patrons and students and alumni is to see if they can track the path of a virtual wizard in a way that might explain how an Osama bin Laden, if he was a virtual wizard, could not create in the real world violations of the laws of physics.
Right.
Right? Of course,
so there's
he could
a couple
in
things I think we need to just, again, explain further so that people are following where we're going with all this. First of all, David, you speak all the time about AWACS, the AWACS weapons director. patent that allows them to switch from a simulation to a live fire. So we've pictured an AWAC aircraft, which is, what is the function of an AWAC aircraft? How does it play this role?
Yeah, it's an airborne warning and command system, and I think Boeing made about 70 of them, and they're around the world. I think NATO has several, and hypothetically, of course, there could have been a NATO AWACS above Washington and above New York on 911, transmitting command and control signals to the aircraft participating in what the insiders, most of the insiders, have thought was a continuity of government exercise, not realizing potentially that someone with the skill set, but not necessarily the man himself, someone with the skill set of David G. Swigart could hack into a Boeing AWACS aircraft and switch from simulation to live fire. Or, alternatively, he could have been retained by the United States Air Force to hack in to various aircraft in the United States, including Boeing civilian passenger aircraft, to see how vulnerable they were to being taken over remotely.
Right, and to clarify that statement, David, you're referring to Mr. Swigart's boasts that as an ethical hacker, he's involved in resilience training and testing, and basically an ethical hacker, as we understand it, is hired by any variety of companies to test how safe their systems are to hacking. So they try to hack in. And the question that you and I have repeatedly raised is, during the course of that ethical process, is it possible that the process itself compromises the system sufficiently so that someone unethical could piggyback on that resilience test and get in there and do something malicious, potentially even without the ethical hacker knowing?
Oh, absolutely right. And here you come back to the custody of evidence or data that's collected at a crime scene that must not be broken.
Yes.
Because if it's broken, and for example, using this split tunnel patent, if the time stamping of data collected from the timestamp is stripped away from that data and fed to a white list of insiders, let's say hypothetically these elite teachers, what you offer to those teachers is they can engage in what is known as Deadpool betting.
Right.
That is to say, they could bet on the body counts and the time of death of the people inside the aircraft or on the ground who have been basically identified at a particular point and a particular time, accurate to a millisecond. Meanwhile, the blue team, let's say if they've been deprived of the timestamps that would give them a good idea of time, are obliged to look up at the clock on the wall.
Right.
Right? And I believe that's what happened in the Pentagon. The folks in the Pentagon, the blue team defenders during that exercise, they were deprived of the timestamps and they became victims. So Captain Gerald Oconto and 125 of his colleagues in the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center were obliterated. No autopsies have been done. And within 10 minutes of the impact, there was a group of people with FBI T-shirts on the Pentagon lawn, picking up evidence, taking it away, putting it in a brown paper bag, and maybe bringing it back to Canada, because those people with the FBI T-shirts could have been prisoners or parolees being tracked by the Jerome Lemelson prisoner tracking patent, which uses artificial intelligence expert systems or fuzzy logic algorithms to determine whether the privileges or punishments of the prisoner or the parolee should be upgraded or downgraded depending on whether they're doing what they're told. Right?
And of course, the point that we're making overall is that there was so much chaos and confusion. There's so many people depicted in this photograph removing elements from the crime scene. We've seen other photos where people are touching debris from the crime scene, not even wearing gloves, not even having evidence collection bags necessarily. There's all this unexplained stuff. We've got, barrels of chemicals. We've got hoses all over the place. The hoses are ostensibly fire hoses to put the fire out, but there's pieces of aircraft debris strewn about. It doesn't look like the organized collection of evidence that's intended to reassemble a plane and do an evaluation of, was there a bomb, was there a missile. We've seen this with TWA Flight 800. It's standard operating procedure for the NTSB to gather and reassemble every piece of an aircraft to do their investigation, and that did not happen on 9/11.
No, that's right. So now here's a little challenge for Mr. Swigart, if he could take time off from his bizarre focus on a hoax bomb and the port of Charleston, where if I remember, he's probably scrubbed this video. He talks about the fake bomb based on residual cesium-137 from a dentist's practice, combined with a flashbang, basically is no more dangerous than dropping a light bulb in the car park of Walmart.
Yeah.
Well, I've worked with cesium-137, but I think this is a metaphor that's beyond bizarre. It's beyond anything I could think of. But here's a little challenge. I had asked for him, and he hasn't responded, if he could explain in the real world how a weapons platform could punch a tunnel through the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center through 8 walls, and he hasn't responded to that. But here's another little challenge. I don't know if you've heard, or our listeners have heard, of the 24th Air Force, 24AF. It's the operational warfighting organization that establishes, operates, maintains, and defends Air Force networks and conducts full-spectrum operations in cyberspace. It establishes, operates, and defends Air Force networks to ensure warfighters can maintain the information advantage as they fulfill military operations. The unit is responsible to conduct a full range of cyber operations. So I guess the 24th Air Force headquarters might invite Mr. Swigart in to test for vulnerabilities. I think that's a reasonable presumption.
Is that the joint base in San Antonio, Texas?
Yeah. Anyway, I think they could and should perhaps have invited Mr. Swigart in if he was a really competent ethical hacker. Well, here's something that might disturb or discourage the senior people in the Air Force. They actually brought in a company called SERCO to do the following. SERCO also integrated voice, video teleconferencing capabilities, and situational awareness displays, along with the VDI, into the facilities network distribution system across multiple networks. The result is an integrated IP-based internet protocol, presumably based total capability that is centrally managed and consistent across all platforms. SERCO also implemented, and I shake my head, Defense Red Switch Network, DRSN, completed a structured fiber optic and Category 6 cabling system, and participated in the construction design working group to ensure supporting systems, e.g. power and HVAC, were able to support the 24 AF's IT needs. As a result of SERCO's support, 24th Air Force enjoys a true state-of-the-art environment that has delivered the high level of performance and security required to continue fulfilling the important missions protecting the nation's security. Well, I'm saying, I'm not an American, I'm a Brit turned Canadian, looking at you guys as a friend, saying, I know you're crazy, but what the hell is going on here?
Yeah.
You've brought in SERCO to operate the National Visa Center, which allowed the sleeper cells to come in from Saudi Arabia through Dubai into the United States, probably through distribution amongst faculty in universities and maybe the Small Business Administration protege program. You've allowed SERCO to operate the National Defense Ammunition Center, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the back office of Obama's Obamacare, right, the Affordable Care Act. What haven't you given away to the British? Now, let's assume the British are allies of the United States, but not necessarily all the British are allies of the United States. A small group, I believe, of elite teachers maybe Marxist, maybe Leninist, but I think that's a distraction, that formed what is known as the Worshipful Company of Educators, which is one of the 110 livery companies of the City of London, and they date back to the 12th, 13th century.
And
The
that's why
City
we're
of London,
talking about these city and guilds, right?
yes, that's right. And these guilds or livery companies are granted letters patent by the Crown, which gives them the right to practice an exclusive trade or profession in a given area. It also, underlying that, is they have the ability, deep in history, of destroying interlopers. Well, let me give an example of an interloper for the Worshipful Company of Insurers, perhaps, out of the City of London. Aon Corporation was in the top of the South Tower in 911, and I think it lost, of course, that's a euphemism, about 197 Aon staff were murdered on 911 in that controlled demolition of the South Tower. The headquarters of Aon at that time were in Chicago. Do any of the listeners wonder where the headquarters are now? Well, I'll tell them. They're in London.
Yeah.
And the Worshipful Company of Insurers shares the same meeting hall as the Worshipful Company of Firefighters.
That's amazing. And you told me that last week. I did not know that. But, you know, again, David, a lot of people think these connections that you make are tenuous or don't make sense, but you always draw them back to essentially direct connections.
Well, totally. SERCO is the world's largest air traffic controller, non-public, right? So why haven't anyone in the FBI and Mueller's team, or Christine Marcy, because she launched the United States Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System, nicknamed Con Air, she would have used one or more on a regular basis of SERCO's FAA contract towers, which are small contract towers operated by SERCO staff that would have the ability, provided they knew the right sort of codes, to transmit telemetry signals into planes so that they could be flown through what are known as ad hoc waypoints on 911 and ultimately peeled off on a trajectory that would take them into the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center. Right? So what was SERCO meeting on the 47th floor, Mr. Mueller, why didn't you check who the shareholder representatives were at that meeting on the 47th floor? Who died? Well, I'll tell you, because you're not doing your job. None of them died. They all got away. But very important, the chief executive officer of SERCO, one Christopher Hyman, was at a breakfast meeting of the Risk Waters Group in the windows of the World Restaurant at the top of the North Tower. Around 8:30, he got up and he went down to the 47th floor to join a meeting of shareholders with, I believe, can't prove it, but maybe one day we can, the SERCO investment banker, one Wilbur Ross. So he joins these representatives. Now, amongst those shareholder representatives would be someone from the government of Saudi Arabia, the government of the United Kingdom, and the government of Singapore. There would be 10 global custodian banks with $100 trillion of assets under management, and many of those banks would report back, either informally or formally, to the Worshipful Company of International Bankers in the City of London. So why wouldn't I assume that you've got a virtual wizard, and why wouldn't Americans assume there is a virtual wizard out there, conceived, if you will, by the elite teachers at the University of Illinois, Chicago, such as Bill Ayers, the psychopathic terrorist leader, and conceived by, the conception process is perhaps a little difficult to get your head around visually, but then Bernardine Dawn, on faculty at the Northwestern University, whose Northwestern University IT partnerships around the world, much of them on fiber optic links, Jason, include the BBC. So if I want to inject a fake news story with a virtual wizard identity, Mallow or Osama bin Laden, where would I inject the story? Well, I'd inject it into the BBC, right? So the BBC propagates the myth around the world, right? And the United States Air Force is hacked possibly by a virtual hacker, an ethical hacker, possibly by an unethical hacker, or possibly by someone who knows how to use the patent keys that are used by someone like David Swigart to test the vulnerability of the Air Force. That is to say, all of your arms of government, I believe, well, the military, Marine Corps, Navy, United States Air Force, and Army have now been backdoored through SERCO, the British company, and the Northwestern University IT partnerships, which link up to the Russian Federation and China. Over to you.
Yeah, and we'll be getting into this much more, David, in our 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific show that's going to be happening on Patreon. And I'm just showing everyone the government agencies that are connected to the Northwestern University IT partnerships, all countries, and then very strangely, Chicago and Evanston are the only two cities listed there among Japan, New Zealand, Norway, Republic of Korea, the Russian Federation, Singapore, all these, and the state of Illinois, of course. So those stand out where we've got cities and states among entire countries, and we'll be getting into that much more as we move forward with the show. I want to remind people that they should be going over to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, become a sponsor of David's, and you can get onto his Patreon page, see his daily posts and all the videos that we're creating together. I hope that people will also sponsor Crowdsource the Truth on patreon.com/crowdsource the truth and subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. David, I wanted to ask you a bit more about some of the other people that we have listed here, and also to go into, some of the things that we say are not well understood by some of the more dense viewers out there on the internet. For instance, when you're describing a hack of the Boeing 787 MAX 8, you and I know fully well that it was an angle of attack sensor feeding information into an MCAS system that was designed to handle a nose-up situation or a nose-down situation to use software to avoid a stall, and that this attitude the airplane performance characteristic was introduced when Boeing wanted to create a longer range, more fuel-efficient 737 MAX 8. They did this by using engines with substantially larger compressor fans that made the entire engine much larger, that forced a relocation of the engine and changed the balance of the aircraft. Now, someone in our comments earlier was mentioning, David, that there was a 60 Minutes Australia interview with a 737 pilot who was expressing his shock, his indignation over what he explained as Boeing having made this substantial change without properly instructing pilots as to what the system was. So what we're describing is a virtual reality artificial intelligence software algorithm that controlled the nose-up characteristics of the plane in a way that the pilots didn't understand and caused a crash. Now, we're not saying that someone hacked into the plane and actively took control over the plane and fought with the pilots, but what we're suggesting is, how did that software get written? What's in there? What type of hacking could be done? And of course, we've heard the statement many times, David, that no matter how secure a system, the Federal Bridge, anything, you name it, it can be hacked. And if you can't hack the system, you hack the user. So what exactly is ethical hacking? What is social engineering? What is mind hacking? We've heard students of Mr. Swigart talk about their proclivity for mind hacking. And again, I'm not accusing, and I don't believe you're accusing, any specific individual of hacking Boeing or hacking the Federal Bridge. We're just pointing out that these things could be done, and then it's interesting to see who pops to the surface to try to instruct people not to listen to us and to try to instruct people not to support patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth.
Well, I think you put your finger on it. I mean, the situation with crimes, or let's say the murder for hire networks, if they are systematically removing timestamps with data from a crime scene that would normally allow the FBI to reconstruct the events that led up to the crime, then the crime is not solvable under present circumstances. So I think the fallback position is that we can offer to the public is if we can show a method by which negligence, recklessness, willfulness, or even fraud in the use of these patented devices resulted in the wrongful death, the proper remedy, of course, is in the civil courts. Over to you.
Yeah, right. And we'll be getting into that much more when we resume our show in 20 minutes. So there's some other people here on the photo collage today, David, that I want us to talk about real briefly. I apologize. I forgot to include Bill and Hillary Clinton in the evil teachers area here. And of course, we haven't really touched on the fact that Hillary Clinton grew up in Chicago, didn't she? Her father was kind of like a famous mobster. Perhaps we should start including Hugh Rodham.
Yeah, well, I think so. And just going back to the role of teachers, I don't think we got Professor Raoul Franklin in amongst the teachers. And that's important because the way I see the public, our patrons, students and alumni solving this is by monitoring in real time the kinds of data that the teachers are getting that would allow them, let's say, to engage in Deadpool. Well, let's take the demolition of the Twin Towers. If you observe that as an engineer and with some background in explosives, which I have, I look at I forget now whether it's the South Tower or the North Tower come down, but a big block of the building appears to swivel and start to tilt, which means there's some angular momentum building up that normally with a solid object should carry through, and the top section of the tower should have fallen sideways. But when you look at that tower, you can see what's happening is something highly energetic is going on inside that tower, because actually it's projecting 10-ton girders at about 80 miles an hour on a parabolic arc, and they're embedding themselves in buildings 100 meters away. Well, that's not gravity. So I've been thinking, I believe Judy Wood has talked about directed energy weapon. Mm-hmm. I look at that and I say, well, I think I could understand how some high temperature stuff could melt the box columns inside the towers. For example, the thermite reaction gets up to 5,600 degrees Fahrenheit, which is twice the melting point of the steel. But that still wouldn't explain, this almost a plasma effect. So I started looking, and I've only just started, the possibility there are patterns out there where you have a combination of a resonant acoustic condition combined with a very high temperature, like 5,600 from a thermite reaction. Seems to be a possibility you can plasmify the material inside the tower, and literally it drifts away on the wind. So then I went back and looked at the master of the worshipful company of educators, which would represent the kinds of people that are represented by the teachers in the United States. And I found a Professor Raoul Franklin, and it turns out that he's a world authority on plasma physics. And I thought, what a great guy to ask. How would he bring those towers down in that very peculiar manner, which is obviously not gravitational, because gravitational acts down, creates a debris field, much of which is just a fine dust that sprinkled over lower Manhattan. Now, if you put a thermite reaction in close to cement, which has got entrained water in it, the water is going to turn into superheated steam, and it's going to blow the cement into a powder. And that's what you see. Those buildings were demolished by very sophisticated explosives of the kind that I bet Professor Franklin could explain. Over to you.
Yeah, and people remember that. I mean, again, a lot of what happened on 9/11, David, I think is, people were so traumatized, you become very susceptible to believing whatever you're told about the events. And of course, I think most people don't accept the official story. because it doesn't make sense. And when you point out the details of it, it just gives us more facts and a deeper understanding of the whole thing. We're almost out of time here for our preview show, David, so I hope that people will make their way over to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth or subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. They can become sponsors there, and for as little as $1 a month, $1 or $2, $5, whatever suits someone, they can help support the show. They can help sustain this effort. And I mean, when you think about it, David, it's really less than you'd pay for one newspaper if you're at the airport, or even a cup of coffee. I think most people are buying coffee every day, spending quite a lot of money on it. If you find yourself watching the show every week, it's so important that you become a sponsor. People have suggested, David, that we switch to an advertiser-based model, but I don't want to do that, A. And B, most of what we're talking about is very unpopular with companies that would advertise. When I put out videos on YouTube, they're very frequently marked by YouTube as unsuitable for advertising. So that doesn't work in terms of creating a sustainable model for you and I to carry on with this. So hopefully people will sponsor our show by going to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. People can also, David, look at your work on your webpage, reversecciscripts.com. They can follow you on Twitter. You are there at CSI Hawkins. So there's lots of ways to keep up with David and his daily posts. Whoops, David, we seem to have lost you there. David, can you hear me? Okay, we'll try to get David back. Luckily, he was with us in time to reach the end of the free preview here, and we will be back in just about 15 minutes on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. It's very important that we have your support. I want to thank everybody who already is a generous Patreon sponsor, and you can join us in live chat on Discord for the Patreon and Subscribestar show. We're looking forward to seeing everybody there. Have a great weekend, and thanks for watching, everybody.